You in this course to think about what we mean when we say health and healing. And so in this section, in this lecture, I want to look at the idea of healing versus curing as developed within the Jewish community. Now, obviously this exists across culture, but it's very prominent here, so I'm going to use the example from this tradition. So former director of Harvard's Religion, Health and Healing Initiative, Susan Sarid, has noted that Jewish Americans have been a community that adopted the biomedical model perhaps more than any other community. So she knows that the wholehearted embracing of this approach resulted in very little in the way of interest in approaches to health and healing until the 1990s. And so the Jewish community, particularly female rabbis, became very active alongside people from other traditions in the alternative health movement that really gained momentum in the 1990s. And I will be talking about this more when we get to the New Age movement. So they were influenced by things like Buddhist meditation, yoga, and so on, but wanted to give it a Jewish overlay. And so we see a number, as I said, of these rabbis taking up this initiative of bringing some of these ideas about the connection between health and healing into using Jewish principles. So I think it's interesting to note that part of the Jewish attitude is that obviously complete cure is not available, that eventually the body becomes weakened and everybody dies at some point. And I think this is a very important part of this larger movement, looking at the ways in which we have become a death-denying society, and that's probably related to secularism. So up until very recently, it was something no one wanted to talk about, no one wanted to think about. And so this Jewish healing movement talks about the idea that there is no perfectibility within a human life, that we're all subject to illness and frailty, and so it's incumbent upon all people to care for those who are sick and vulnerable. And so it is a mitzvot, it's a commandment within Judaism that you visit the sick, and so it's not a choice really. You're expected to visit the sick, and so this idea that just as human beings we're fundamentally vulnerable, and so we have to care for those who are ill. From Religion and Healing in America, and it was something that an informant told the writer Susan Sarid. And so she said, it isn't always possible to cure, but it is always possible to heal. And so on its face, this seems contradictory. So I think we need to unpack it. So from within this view, the idea is that biomedicine tends to be always focused on cure. And so if possible, obviously, you want to completely cure the person. But because we're human beings and we're subject to illness, that isn't always possible. So from a religious point of view, healing is always possible. So those actions you can take to help heal the person spiritually, emotionally, mentally, and so on are always available. And so religion can move into this space where perhaps biomedicine may have to retreat if there's no cure possible. Say it's chronic illness. So the idea that the community and family can then move in to provide these other kinds of healing. That I've read that come out of the Jewish healing movement, they're very clear that this is not meant to replace biomedicine. It's meant to complement it. And so it's important then to look at what they mean by health and healing in this context. So I'm using here a quote from Rabbi Nancy Flam. Healing is a sense of wholeness, perspective, reintegration, and not the removal of a tumor or clearing of infection. It addresses the dimension of the person that was suffering and not just the disease. So the idea that healing is looking at the whole person, so spiritual, mental, emotional, all of these aspects, not just the physical. And so that can be restored even if the body is still ill. So this is a very different way of looking at health and healing than a secular one that looks only at the body. And so again, emphasizing the humanity of the person. The person is not just an illness, and this certainly can happen. I'm sure many of you are familiar in your own families or communities where when a person becomes ill, that can sort of subsume everything, and people can lose sight of the fact that they're still themselves, they're still a person. And so one of the informants also said that these practices allow people to live in Jewish time. So if they're in a hospital, obviously we talked about that aspect of you lose a lot of control, but this is sort of reasserting Jewish time, Jewish practice, even within the schedules of, for instance, a hospital. A poem by Zelda, an Israeli poet who was documenting her experiences when she was undergoing treatment. And I think this speaks for a lot of people and how they feel often during these treatments. And again, that can also get lost. Obviously, when somebody's ill, you know, everybody around them is rushing to get them the proper medicine and medical aid that they need, but often the feeling of the person can get lost, the individuality of the person can get lost in that process, unfortunately. So she writes, "They set my shamed flesh before the dragon of science without asking my soul. 10 heads of the lofty dragon observed my misery without asking my soul." I think this is very powerful, the way it captures how you can feel in these institutionalized settings where you're not being treated like a human being. And so Zelda in this poem is reasserting that spiritual aspect, the sanctity of human life, of the individual, even within this whole mechanism and all the machinery and all the technology and so on that's around her. I think it's very interesting that use of the shamed flesh. And I think that's often how a sick person may feel, that somehow they're imperfect and they failed, is particularly within that kind of Enlightenment paradigm. And so I find it interesting also, she calls it the dragon of science. So it's almost like she's being put on trial. You have a sense of her standing in front of these people who are judging her failure, observing my misery without asking my soul. So I think this poem is really getting at what the whole movement is talking about, that it's reasserting both for people who are medical doctors and nurses and for the family, that we have to always remember that whether somebody's sick or not, they're still themselves. Ways, obviously, in which Jewish practice and ritual can come in and reassert that sacred time, that individuality. And I just wanted to look at one practice that's gaining in popularity within the Jewish community. And so it's the Mi Shebarak prayer. And in her ethnographic study of members of the Jewish community in Arizona, Gillis Silverman looked at this healing practice, and she found that the prayer, which is an ancient prayer, was being used in both a traditional and modernized form in synagogues, homes, hospitals, and healing circles. So, so this prayer, for instance, could be said in the synagogue by the congregation for somebody. So some of you may be familiar with this practice in Christian churches. So the name of the sick person is read out and the prayer is said by everybody. So you can see immediately the idea that you symbolically and actually you're getting community support. So if the family is there in the congregation, they feel the support of that community around them in the saying of the prayer. And also when the name is read, people in the congregation might not have known that person was ill. So that may also cause them to go visit the person or to inquire of the family how they're doing. And so this practice serves a variety of functions, both supporting the family and the sick person, who just knowing people are praying for you. Obviously, if you're a religious person, has an impact on you psychologically. So let's look at the prayer. Merciful One, restore him or her, heal him or her, strengthen him or her, enliven him or her. Send him or her a complete healing from the heavenly realm, a healing of body and a healing of soul, together with all who are ill, soon, speedily, without delay. And let us say Amen. Okay, so we can see from this poem the idea merciful one, so that's speaking to God. So you're calling on God. So the idea that the healing is coming from the divine, it's not coming from any person. And the idea that the power of God will strengthen the person and will bring healing to them. So we also see healing of body and healing of soul. So the idea that there's all these dimensions to the human person, and that this will happen as quickly as possible. So we can see with this prayer, which is, as I said, gaining in popularity within the Jewish community, it's very flexible. It can be used in a variety of settings, and it serves a variety of functions, supporting the community, the family, and the person who is experiencing the illness.